Darling one, you were born from the sweetest love, cast from the fires of creation, burning bright into the making of your perfect constellations. Head high, my love, never let them diminish you. Stand tall in the power of your love. Break open to the thousands come before you, written in your heart with holy blood. Keep going, my love. Hold tight to the scripture of your inheritance, your dreams born from ancient stone. Weave your magic star of wisdom, breathing life into hollow bones. Courage, my love. Place pain upon your sacred altars. Grow seeds where life has become hopeless. Lend hands to those who fall and falter. Let love be life's greatest opus. Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome to Dreaming the Ancestors. It's been a little while since I have done a new episode, and I'm so excited to be here today with Isla Macleod for this beautiful episode. And just as a reminder, this podcast series is really where we come together to talk about remembering and reclaiming ancestral stories, feminine wisdom, and earth magic. And this is the 8th episode of the 2nd season, where I'm really focusing on uplifting voices from Ireland and Britain. And we are streaming live on Facebook and YouTube. A very warm welcome to everyone who's here live. Please feel free to say hello in the chat and share where you're calling in from. I'm going to take this opportunity to introduce Isla. Isla describes herself as a creator of ceremonies, ritual designer, transformational healer, and companion at the thresholds, inspired by nature, foraged by her longing, devoted to remembering. She is a lover of moss, mushrooms, trees, wild swimming, and moonlight. And she is also the author of the book Rituals for Life, which is a guide for those searching for the sacred in the everyday, a life of meaning and a sense of belonging. In our increasingly secular world, we need to find the ways to restore connection, mend the bridges to the divine, and remember our place in the web of life. So this book, Rituals for Life, invites the reader to discover how ritual can provide the bridge back to wholeness through aligning with the wisdom of nature, the cycles of life, and re-enchanting the world with wonder and beauty. So excited to get my copy of Rituals for Life later this week. It's just come out in the US this month, really exciting. And I'm going to take this chance now to bring on Isla to introduce herself as well. Welcome, Isla. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. It's such a joy to be here with you in conversation. I've found a long time that there's been such a resonance with your work, and I'm glad to be bringing forth some of this wisdom from these Isles of Brigantia.
Thank you, dear one. Maybe you can show everyone a copy of your book as well before I forget. And remind me when this came out in the UK. It was very recent.
Yeah, it was autumn equinox in September, so it's available online from most booksellers. And it is a nice handy size companion with lots of illustrations along the way. Sorry, I don't know if you can see that in the light, but yeah, lots of inspiration for anyone seeking to create more ritual in their lives.
Mm-hmm. Ritual is such a beautiful pathway to belonging. And of course, that's our topic for today. I'm really excited to dive into this beautiful conversation. But before we begin, as always, I want to take this moment for us all to just close our eyes and imagine that we're coming together in the flesh, heart to heart, around a great fire. And we can really visualize ourselves sitting by this fire together in circle, just as our ancestors have done for thousands of years stretching back into the mists of time, the fire is a place to share wisdom and share stories. And as we hold this vision in our hearts and minds of being gathered around the fire, I'd like to take a moment to invite our ancestors into this space with us, to be in conversation with us. And so for those of you who are listening, I invite you to take a moment to invite your ancestors into the space in whatever way feels resonant for you. Perhaps you invite in the wise elders. Perhaps you take a moment to honor your grandmother or your grandfather or those who you've loved and who have passed. And just really feel the ancestors coming in, connecting with us, and for that acknowledgement to take place. And for the next few moments, I'm going to invite in my ancestors and then invite Isla to invite in her ancestors as well. So I'd like to honor all of my ancestors in this moment. But particularly the ancestors who are calling to me are the ancestors from England. I really want to take this moment to acknowledge those ancestors and to feel the ways that they were in connection with the lands that they lived upon. On my father's side, we have a very strong connection to the Isle of Wight and can trace back my ancestors there to the 1400s. And there's a really, really strong sense of connection to place, which innately comes with a sense of belonging. And so I honor that part of my lineage, that patriarchal part of my lineage. I honor all of my ancestors who really knew what it meant to belong to place. And I'd also like to honor the ancestors of this land that I'm on here in so-called Colorado. I want to honor the Ute and Arapaho people whose lands these belong to. And with that, I will pass over to you, Isla.
Yeah, I wish to call forth all of my kin, of my blood and my bones, those wise and well elders of my lineages, and asking them to breathe their inspiration and wisdom through me. Those from the distant lands up in the Outer Hebrides on my father's side, and those of my mother's side from Dartmoor, from Pembrokeshire, from Kent. Honouring too the spirits that have tended this land that I live with in Somerset in England. I also welcome those elders of earth and fire and air and water, and give thanks for the ways that they weave within and around me. And inviting all those wild ones who have guided and fed me on my journey, the stone people, the tree kin, the moss and mushroom and lichen clans, and all those who wish to be warmed beside this hearth as we remember our roots and the ways that we are woven together in belonging.
Thank you, Isla. So beautiful. Welcome to all the ancestors. So this episode is called Pathways of Belonging and Courting the Sacred. And I'm really excited to dive into this discussion and really tap into the roots of what it means to belong. As someone who offers nature-based feminine wisdom and ancestral teachings to the world, I'm very attuned to the fact that people are longing for meaningful ways to belong. People are longing to connect with their own sense of ancestry and heritage and cultural traditions and earth connection. And I've noticed that these kinds of people tend not to identify with a lot of the dominant culture that we see around us, who were sort of born to question what is deemed normal in our society. And for those of you listening, perhaps you resonate with this. This is certainly true for me. And, the kinds of questions that we often hold in our hearts are things like, what does it mean to belong to this earth? What does it mean to have roots? What does it mean to belong to my lineage, my ancestors, my cultural heritage? And for those of you who feel this longing to belong, you'll know just how deep it goes. Belonging is part of our human identity. And it's not really a nicety, but a need, a really deep need. And it feels important to honor this and to share our experiences on our unique pathways of belonging and what it means in our lives as a lived evolutionary experience. So I'd like to pass over to Isla now to share some of her beautiful wisdom. So, Isla, I would love to begin by hearing a little bit about your personal journey and how you came to this work of ritual and ceremony as a pathway to belonging, and what were some of your early influences that really set you onto this path?
Well, I think all of us have started from this place of separation. Just that severance from the mother at birth creates this ongoing need for union in some way. I'm sure we'll get onto more of that later, but it was very pronounced for me because I was born abroad in Barbados, and then my father's job took us to different countries along the way, and in that uprooting and lack of a sense of home in terms of, rootedness or family and community, I saw quite quickly that ritual offered me something of a way of connecting. And I think there were times, my family weren't religious in any way, but there were certain seasonal rhythms that I remember, like, adorning the Christmas tree or carving the pumpkin. There were these sort of rituals throughout the year that created this rhythm that enabled some sense of belonging and understanding of that relationship with the natural cycles. But it wasn't till I started boarding school when I was 8 that I think there was this desperation of a need to connect and find some meaning in this sense of abandonment. And I had, over time, from living in Nigeria, gathered different items that spoke to me from the markets, and I'd essentially created my first altar on this sort of portion of shelf in my dormitory. And there were ways that I began to explore just to make sense of my emotions and hold myself with things that were difficult and challenging. And through things like bowing down to something, which for somebody that didn't resonate with the church or any of the traditions from my sort of primary school, was quite surprising. But there was something in that bowing down to that I felt really necessary, that there was something bigger than me that was taking care of me. And although that was kind of quite an innocent exploration of ritual in some ways, it was the seed, I think, of obviously the path to come. And although most of my adolescence was quite off that path in terms of not finding ways, or certainly peers or elders that could guide me more in this way of ritual and spiritual connection. But I did have a Buddha from aged 8, and this Buddha was my elder, was my beacon of inspiration, whom from very early on I just knew how to be with, and I would sit quietly with and light incense and ask for help. And there was something in that relating that really inspired in me this yearning to honor the sacred and bow down to something. And I think it was around early 20s, after really quite going off the rails of not having this place, this space to connect, that it felt quite desperate and I felt quite depressed, and knew that something needed to shift in my life to come back to a sense of meaning and purpose. And through really exploring the Buddhist tradition for some time and finding there was a lot in that that served me, of sort of coming home to myself and really working with my inner realm and my emotions, I I found my way towards Tibetan Buddhism because I liked all the instruments and the art and the costumes. And for me, there was something that my soul resonates with, which is the beauty that's created through ritual, this sensory experience on all levels. And so it's been sort of the last 15 years of really just exploring what that can look like without the tradition or forms to work with or to have inherited. But there were a few key people I remember, and it was sort of a wizard really, but he was my drum teacher, and I started playing percussion when I was 8, and the drum room was separate from the whole music school 'cause it was so loud. And now I realize that there was this, every time I went to that percussion room, it was me entering my temple. It was an opportunity for me to be with myself, process my emotions. It was my therapy, really. Um, and so when I look back, I can see in my teacher, he was just always encouraging me to really just like find the rhythm of my heart. What is the rhythm that wants to come through? And I'm so grateful that there have been along the way those angels really that just nudged me towards looking at things a bit differently. Yeah, too many to say here, but just honoring them and giving thanks for them.
Beautiful. I love imagining little Isla having her first altar, and it just fills my heart with so much warmth. And yeah, similar to you, from a very young age, I kind of always had this longing for a sense of sacredness in life. And I, didn't have the words for it for quite a long time, but I did feel this yearning, this calling for that sacredness that I just really didn't see sort of reflected in the culture around me. And when I actually visited your website in preparation for this podcast, I noticed that you used the phrase courting the sacred. And it really, really sung to my soul, because that cultivation of the sacredness is something that's not just given to us. It's something that we have to actively tend to court, like any relationship that's meaningful. And I would love to hear more about your ideas on courting the sacred and how this can support our journeys to belonging.
Mm. Yeah, there's something which, when that came to me as a sort of phrase, that just it landed so deeply. As of course we have to court the sacred. It is something with all relationships around something we're devoted to that requires that tending and care and love. And I like the sort of the notion of eros, which is this idea that we have um, this force of love. It's like an earthly primal love that is what we are devoted to, that it's something that we want to bow down to. And as I described, there wasn't really an understanding of or any sort of example of that other than going to church and just seeing people kneeling on the church pews. But there is something which, when I bow down, there is this humbling of myself. There is a love that pours forth, and I am so fed by this relationship that I want to give back and I want to attend to it well. So it can be such a playful exploration of what that might look like to you. But I, imagine the sacred as the other in some way. And how would you wish to take them on a date? What would that look like? What do you think they would really enjoy for you to give them? And what offerings would really feed them? And I think a lot of it comes down to really expressing beauty as a way of courting the sacred, expressing your creativity, expressing yourself, and offering up your gifts as a gesture of your commitment to the sacred. And I think too, there's this, it's a matter of perception too. And I often wonder, is the sacred revealed to us, or is it something that we create and cultivate? And I, from very young, always sought meaning and trying to understand what gives meaning to human life. And ultimately we create it ourselves. And I know that I might look for meaning a little bit too much in everything, like anything's a sign or an omen. But there is for me this infusion then, and like enchantment that the world then offers back to me, that it comes alive. And I know that I am participating in this dynamic of what the sacred is to me is unique. And yet there is this sort of collective sense of the sacred that we can also, well, at this time, I think it's really vital that there is this restoration of the sacred. For so long, it's been desecrated in so many ways, and it might not look how it used to. It might not be the same symbols and forms and ideas that our ancestors held. So now it's reimagining what is the sacred for us, what feeds our soul and our spirit with a sense of purpose and connection and belonging, and how can we attend to it in a way that offers something of ourselves that is, I think it's difficult with our Western mind sometimes to sort of surrender or sacrifice something of ourselves, but that is what is required. At the altar of the sacred, there needs to be some reciprocity that we give and we receive. So it can be that for me, there's a lot of listening in. So if I'm out somewhere in the wild and wanting to go on a sort of soul quest or pilgrimage, then I'm really trusting in what ideas bubble up of how to honor this place. And I've been called to do a striptease before. I've been invited to, write a poem. Poetry for me is definitely one of my primary modes of courting the sacred. But those sort of, you think of the Sufi mystics like Rumi and Hafiz, they knew how to court the sacred. It's through our words and our actions and the way that we also live our life that in itself can be a gesture and an offering of how we wish to feed the sacred. And that could be that, we almost sort of like dress up for it. It might be that we adorn ourselves. It might be that we, there was something, there's a book, Big Magic, which is a great book by Elizabeth Gilbert. And she talks about the genie in the room when you're writing or doing some creative project. And it really spoke to me that we need to sort of dress up to come and show up at our desk in the mornings, put on the lipstick, wear a kimono. And for me, it's really playful to have that invitation that it's not something dour, this sort of expression of spiritual longing that maybe religion used to encourage to some extent, that it had to be quite serious and demure. And I think as we're also seeing this resurgence of feminine ancient wisdom, that there is this longing to be wild and expressive and really show up in our fullest selves without holding anything back. And for me, that's something which really feeds the sacred, that there's this kind of celebration and cheer the more that we do that. So they would be some of my invitations.
So beautiful. Resonates so much with that. And I love the idea of showing up at our desks with that deep intention of courting the sacred before we begin our day and before we begin our work in the world. And that's something that I've really lent into with my writing practice. So some of you will know that I've been writing a book for about 3 years. And I had a beautiful stretch of time during the summer where I was really sitting down every day and writing. And I had this candle on my desk that I would light right before I would start writing. And I would call in Bridget. And I'd say, in Bridget's name, I light the eternal flame. I'd light my candle and really feel the muse of Bridget coming to help guide my work. And it was such a simple but powerful ritual and a way of courting the sacred, as you beautifully described. And I love too what you shared about, when we have that gap in ancestral knowledge around how did our ancestors court the sacred, how did they show up and tend the land and connect with a sense of place, how did they connect with nature. And those of you here will likely know or maybe know that I'm very devoted to the Irish traditions, and there's so much ancestral wisdom there. And just over the past few months, I've really been working with my English ancestry, which is an interesting dynamic to hold both of those lineages, and realizing how much ancestral wisdom from England has been lost. And I was really grieving about this one day and sitting at my altar and just sort of expressing like so much wisdom has been lost from this part of these islands, and it's been so cut off. I've even heard some people in Ireland describe the English as being cut off at the roots. And the first time I heard that, it like went straight into my heart, and I really felt like, wow, that feels very true to me in lots of ways. And so as I was grieving and connected with my ancestors, I was basically saying, how do I repair what's been lost? And the answer was so simple. And I got this visual of these women gathered around a well. And this idea came through that I can just visually in my being within myself, go to the well every day and sit by those waters and tap into that wisdom that is innately held within the well.
Mm.
It's been cut off from us, but it's always there. And so there's like that courting of the sacred through just showing up at the well every day, just in my visualization. I'm not actually physically even going to a well. And it really created this rhythm. I've heard you talk about rhythms, like it's come through in your shares a few different times. And that rhythm of showing up and courting and being in relationship with feels so potent and so powerful and so joy filled at the same time. Yeah. And, I think that many of us on this path who are seeking this kind of elusive yet powerful sense of belonging often do so because we've had some kind of experience of not belonging. And so, at least I'll share from my perspective, it's like there has been this wound inside of me wanting to be acknowledged and healed around unbelonging. And so, I really hold this question and curiosity around how do we heal our sense of unbelonging. So I would love to sort of dive into this question with you, Isla. Like, how have you personally been on this journey of healing that wound?
Mm. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, it's something which I feel is part of the human condition, that this is the journey of how we come to acknowledge our belonging and our place within ourselves that is worthy and valuable and necessary to be a part of this web of life. And traditionally, after we'd had that severance at birth, we would then start to sort of weave ourselves back together through the tribe, through this relationship with the land that, historically would have been over some sense of time. But now we have such a fragmented way of living, and we obviously don't have those community structures. And I found that the story of for myself around boarding school is the sacred wound that I tend to, and that feeling of being abandoned, in some way rejected, and not knowing where I belonged or where my roots were or home was, infused so much of my sort of soul's evolution through adolescence and early adulthood, that it was something that I perceived all the world through that lens, that I was a part. And there was a particular experience that I had that was sort of the turning point in my life, which was at a Buddhist retreat center. And it was actually a teaching on something called emptiness, or shunyata. And in that, there was some kind of activation or resonance that reminded me of this perception essentially being malleable, and infused with all life is our way of seeing the world and the way we relate to it. But ultimately, there was this sense of everything being completely connected. There was no sense of there. It's sort of laughable to actually imagine that we weren't completely interwoven with each other. And even though that didn't stay as an embodied, felt sense, it was enough for me to sort of turn something on, of a pathway of remembering. Which then led me to move to somewhere in Sussex, into some woodland, and devote myself to being an apprentice to nature and find my way home to myself and to this land. And it started off with really starting to explore the Celtic wheel of the year, so that sort of map of the seasons and the lunar cycles. So saying about rhythms again, there was this need for me to rewire my sense of sort of linear time and this mode of being that was, very much not what I felt internally. And I would often have cyclical depression around sort of winter time. And because I'd never known that it was actually sort of part of our nature to need to withdraw, to hibernate, to turn inwards and slow down, I was just burning myself out and finding that I was suffering a lot mentally and emotionally. So the time I spent in the woods was starting to carve out a sort of a framework of ceremony throughout the year, of ways of honouring the new moon, the full moon ceremony, and working with the different seasonal thresholds. And that took me on a wonderful journey to meet with the 13 sacred trees of the Celtic lunar calendar. So each month I was devoted to really exploring the medicine of and spending time with different trees. And they have been and become, have always been, now I realise, elders in my life when I didn't have the sense of human elders that I was seeking. When I look back even to lonely days at boarding school, there was this one oak tree I would always go and sit with and cry with usually, but that they were this anchor and way of connecting me back to the earth. And but often people, with challenges around more recent ancestry and inheritance of situations, as you described, as being the colonial part of those that colonized and the colonized, that we have all of that within us. And so it can get quite murky, and it's often quite challenging if we're not with a experienced guide to work with those more recent ancestors. For me, it was easier for me to relate with my more than human kin, and it was a starting point for me. And I found that with quite a lot of my clients, that it's sometimes easier as a way in. And the yew tree, particularly when we're looking at working with a sense of our ancestry, they are the guardians of the ancestral realm, and the sort of gatekeepers to the well, obviously in the British Isles and probably elsewhere, yew trees often are found in cemeteries and churchyards because they predate the churches as a place of council and a place where the elders of the tribe would have been buried under the roots of these trees. So something in devoting myself to the yew, which I did over a year, and went through a sort of initiation with, was like a rewiring and a way of remembering the roots of me within this land, which I hadn't felt before. And it does also require this sort of understanding for me that I really resonate with other cultures. And obviously, I was brought up in different cultures which really sung to my soul and my spirit. And I also sort of acknowledge them as being a very vital part of what's made my path so rich in terms of ceremony. And yet there was, and still is, a longing to remember the ceremonies and practices of those of this land, which we haven't had the unbroken lineage to receive, orally or in other ways. So it became, and it will always be, I suppose, the way for me to connect is to go to the source of nature. And for those of us that maybe also no longer living in our ancestral lands, there is this invitation to recognize our wholeness as beings of earth. And of course, there's different flavors and energies and frequencies in different places, but I find it's really freeing to also just recognize that we can go to the spring, the well, and receive the wisdom there and guidance, and trust that flickering of inspiration that comes up about how to create something in that moment to honor the spirit of that place, or visiting sacred stones, and just spending time and walking around and feeling like, okay, how would have my ancestors approached this place? What would they have been doing? And being playful and exploratory and curious in what that might look like, when there is, I know I felt a lot of grief around not receiving those ways and being shown the ways of relating in a good way. So wanting to find, like, wherever there were sort of threads that I could weave with, there was a lot around wanting to be able to attend to these places as a modern woman in these times, but somehow connecting with something much more ancient. And within that, there is this new, fresh way of relating and creating ceremony that also feels like our task in these times to begin to play around with.
Absolutely. As you were sharing, and I'm really feeling the energy of the English ancestors that I called in at the beginning, and feeling the lands of England, I'm reminded that England has been so there were so many different waves of invasion and colonization that happened so long ago, which really cut us off from these ancestral pathways and these pathways of belonging, you know, going all the way back to the Romans 2000 years ago, then the Anglo-Saxons, then the Vikings. You know, it was just one wave after another. And so it's been over, let's say 2000 years since there was a really deep sense of Indigenous and ancestral connection in England especially, but also in other parts of Britain as well, of course, because it wasn't separated that way at that time. And to me, when you're speaking about these pathways of the sacred and really reclaiming some of these innate connections that we have to land, it feels decolonial in nature. And it feels like for us to really come to terms with the violent history that England then went and enacted all over the world, we have to really come back to the roots and reclaim those roots. And this is a really powerful shift. And that's not to bypass, of course, all the harm that was caused. You know, we have to find a way through it. But if we allow ourselves to be taught by the elders, the trees, the sacred wells, it feels like there is this opportunity to decolonize ourselves and really create a new narrative about what it means to be English. You know, I'm speaking specifically about the sort of English heritage right now, but of course, a lot of this applies to all of our lineages and all of our experiences. And this, I really love this sense of the trees and the mycelium as well, literally being these pathways of connection, literally being the roots that we're looking for. And of course, the mycelium connect everything underneath the forest floor. There are these pathways of communication. And so if we can really come to those natural ecosystems with reverence and that sense of courting the sacred, I think there's so much that we can learn about ourselves and learn about what it means to be human and what it means to decolonize ourselves and come back into right relationship with the web of life. Just there's been so much separation and harm and violence. So yeah, that was just coming through and felt really potent in your share, Isla. Yeah. And something that has really helped me these past few months as I have been really deeply working with my English ancestry and various other ancestral wounds that I've been working through is to have an altar space, to really have a place where I can show up and give myself and be guided. And I would just love to, I'm sure lots of people listening have an altar space, but my gosh, Isla, when I see pictures of your altar spaces, there's such a strong energy. I find them really inspirational. For any of you who haven't seen any of Isla's beautiful altars, ancestral spaces, memory spaces, definitely go and check her out on Instagram. But yeah, Isla, I would love to hear about your process of creating an altar. I think it will really help give guidance to the listeners here about how to create an altar with even deeper intention.
Yeah, I think as I shared, it was the starting point really for me of engaging with the sacred in any meaningful way was creating a focal point from which it's like a home for the sacred, a dwelling place for that which is meaningful for me and that which I wish to nurture and give life to. And we can have definitely more than one in our home. I've started now. I've got one in the kitchen. I've got one at the top of the stairs, in the bedroom. That in each room there is a dwelling place for the sacred. And they, for me, start with like really clearing the space. And it's something which you might feel to do at certain shifts personally, if you're going through, you know, if you've started a new job or a new relationship, or it might be that you create a new one for the new moon or with the seasonal shifts. And what you're then creating is a space for the energies which are seeking to emerge through you as a reflection in form. That's how I view them. And so I choose objects that at that time I sort of look around the house and feel, oh, that's something that's speaking to me. Or if there's been certain symbols that I've been working with or keep seeing appearing, then I'll get an image of that or a particular deity that I want to work with. So for now, and often actually on my altar are my antlers. And during my time in the woods, I sort of devoted myself to Cernunnos as a teacher, sort of the wild horned god. And there's something in the reflection that that symbol of the antlers, which are painted gold, offer me in terms of connecting to my own sense of power, of sovereignty, of right relationship with the earth and the wilder parts of myself. So I normally start by placing the central image or object that has something which is sort of that will infuse the rest of the space. And then it would be maybe bringing in some natural elements. So seasonally, just, whether that's some fallen leaves and seeds, candles also just to light up the space, and any other object symbols that you feel are sort of working together as well. That's what's quite interesting on a space of an altar, that they're all in relationship with each other in this kind of mystical dance. And once you've created it, and I think to first sort of activate the altar is quite important. So once you've laid down the initial spread, to light all the candles, to play some music and court the altar. So for me, it normally involves dancing, getting my wings out and smudging the space, and just really welcoming the spirit of this altar to life, to infuse me with what is seeking to emerge. And then over the days or weeks that you have this same altar, it does require feeding. It's sort of, again, coming back to this courting of the sacred, that we want to infuse it with our love, with our gratitude, with our prayers. So every morning I come and spend time with my altar, and I light the candles, and I speak to those guides that I wish to be with me. I really focus on the images and the symbols of the altar space. I usually have a dance with them, and might have actual offerings of food that I place for them, particularly if you have like a Samhain altar with, images perhaps of your ancestors. Then I would offer them whiskey or oats or mead. And then when I feel that altar is sort of complete, then I would take those offerings out to the land. So it changes how long I keep them up. But at the moment, I feel the need to be refreshing them really quite often, because I feel so much is changing so quickly that we need to keep up the sort of with the internal sense of transformation to be reflected in the altar space. But you might have an altar for the kitchen, and there that you tend to the gods that bring you food, and to the corn gods, and those that you wish to give thanks for feeding you and your family. I also have an altar in the garden at Chestnut Tree, and that's my portal place. It's kind of like a sit spot for me to connect with the roots and with the earth wisdom. And that's become a bone altar, and it's just somewhere where I've gathered bones over time, and I'll wash the bones and renew it, so that it's not something that's stagnant or again like an inactive thing. It's something which is very much being tended to and recognized as alive and dynamic. um, so there's some of the ways that I would recommend altar weaving.
Beautiful. So inspiring. I hope some of you listening will feel inspired to, create a deeper relationship with the altars that you do have, or maybe you've never created an altar before and this would be the first time. And I just really encourage you to get curious. And I really love the sort of the playfulness of your approach, Isla, and I feel that woven into your courting of the sacred. And it feels so important, especially because, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of the religions that some of us have encountered or grown up in even have that kind of seriousness a lot of the time. And it feels like part of this dance with the sacred and part of this dance with belonging is to really feel that joy of being alive and being in communion with. So I really get that sense from your creation of the altar spaces, which feels really beautiful. And I actually want to read out a beautiful, a little excerpt from a post that I recently saw on social media about a woman's altar space, and it felt really, really powerful. So this post was written by a woman called Azul Tomei. I hope I'm saying her name right. And she's actually talking about one of her elders in the post. So there's sort of a weaving of these two women here. It's very beautiful. So it says, "My life has become a ritual, acts of beauty for the feeding of my soul and the soul of earth, gestures of gratitude. I wish to thank our dear Sabonfu Some, who was one of the humans who taught me that women without an altar were uprooted. Sobonfu kept saying that all women need an altar, whether small or large, portable or settled in place. To create and feed an altar will root us into life. It is often the first question I now ask in the mentoring I offer. Do you feed an altar? Here in her own words, Sobonfu, you live through us. We remember you with such affection. A child in Africa is born with ritual and dies with ritual. Your life is committed to rituals. We often say in my tradition that you're either doing a ritual, thinking about getting into one, or are in the middle of one, or just finishing one. The purpose of ritual is to connect us to our own essence, to help us tune into the collective spirit, or to mend whatever is broken, whatever wires have been pulled out of one's life, so we can start anew. Ritual is to the soul what food is to the physical body. Yeah, I just want to breathe into that for a moment. And what I feel has really been present throughout our whole conversation, Isla, is this sense of rerouting. And that's really what brings this sense of belonging that so many of us are longing for. That rerouting into the earth. And I loved hearing about your connection with the trees and the way that you devoted yourself to the 13 different tree elders and literally connecting with the physical roots. And there's also the ancestral piece, that those are our roots as well. And it feels like these roots are always available to us, but we have to really put in the work because it is a relationship. And it can be so difficult sometimes to cultivate that sense of commitment and that tending, that constant tending. And I just really encourage everyone to just continue to deepen into that as is right for your life. I understand that life is busy. My life gets so busy sometimes I don't sit at my altar for, a week or, sometimes even more. And, I think we also just have to flow with all of that and be gentle and know that each of us is cultivating this relationship with the sacred in our own way and in our own time. Yeah. Isla, I'd love to just, pass over to you for any final words or pieces of wisdom that just innately want to come through you.
I think just hearing you speak, there's something in the word belonging that's always really fascinated me, that we all yearn to belong. And within, obviously, the word, that there is to be in longing. And I often play around and wonder if there isn't going to be this sort of end place when we feel fully, wholly embodied in our belonging, that we know there might be, and I hope also that this is a possibility. But for me, so much of my creative inspiration and expression comes from that longing. And so there's something in relating differently to that as something which can be painful and challenging, but also it is what creates this kind of alchemy of wanting to experience communion and rootedness and community. And that kind of feeds the sacred in some way. So it's kind of holding all of that and recognizing that we can't also look outside of ourselves to find that belonging. Of course, we can journey to our ancestral lands. We can find ways to, craft and learn the traditions which will support that. But ultimately, at this time, and with the complexities around, cultural appropriation and so many other things to be aware of, it really is, how do we find that place of home within ourselves? And for me, it's about really recognizing how we are made up of the elements, how we are part of these natural cycles. And within that, we all belong as a whole to the earth. And there's something for me that goes beyond borders, beyond even lineages, back to some ancient archetypal idea of the sort of seed carriers of our lineage, of our most ancient grandmother and most ancient grandfather. And like, I have symbols of both of them. So this is my ancient grandmother stone, and this is my ancient grandfather oak. And when we go back to that seed of our lineage and realize there is in our bones, in our DNA, this ancient remembering, then we can connect with something so primordial that the sort of idea of not belonging is almost laughable, that we go so far back. But there is also something in the paradoxical way of life that also serves us to be in longing. Yeah.
I absolutely adore that you brought in this piece about longing. And I read this beautiful book by John O'Donohue. Actually, I'm seeing it on my shelf. Hang on one second. It's called To Bless the Space Between Us. I think that's the book where I really, really got that idea of longing to belong, and how the longing is actually, it's not like there's ever an end destination, like, oh, we suddenly just belong. That's actually not really the reality, especially not right now. And we have to be in that longing to actually experience the belonging. So we're always caught between that space between of belonging and longing, and the longing moves us closer to belonging, and but there's always that space in between. And that's really where the sacredness is, and the magic, and that courting of the sacred we've been talking about. Yeah, the longing to belong, and how sacred that longing is so potent. Yeah. And I also love what you shared about connecting all the way back to the primordial grandmother, grandfather, that really primordial sense of where we come from, that goes beyond anything that we can even conceptualize in our human brain. And it really, the visual that came to me that I thought I would share is that umbilical cord, and how you were talking earlier about how when we're born, the umbilical cord is cut with our physical mother. And I feel like, although this has been so pushed aside and forgotten for so long, I feel like it's our journey through our lives to actually come into connection with that umbilical cord, with like the great mother, the primordial grandmother, the ones who really created us, and the ones who we will go back to when we die. And that forming of the umbilical cord between us as adults, and that beautiful, all embracing sense of, some people would call it God, right? That's obviously like has a more religious connotation, but what I'm really saying here is that all encompassing, all embracing sense of the creator, or mother, grandmother, however we want to relate to that energy. And that umbilical cord is, again, always there for us, but we have to be active in cultivating it and feeding it and being in relationship with it. Yeah. Thank you so much, Isla, for this beautiful, beautiful conversation. And I want to take this moment to really honor the ancestors that we called into this space at the beginning. And I invite everyone listening just to take a moment to close your eyes and reimagine yourself at the fire, to really feel ourselves sitting in circle around that warm hearth, and to feel the warmth of this conversation really radiating out through you and into the ancestral realms, into the unseen realms. And for us really just to take this moment to feel a sense of belonging. Even if you can just touch that belonging with your longing, just take this moment to really feel it. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, I would love to give you this opportunity just to tell everyone where people can find you, and anything else that you want to share about your work and how people can connect with you.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you for such a juicy conversation about all things I love to share. Yes, you can find more of what I do, what I offer, on my website, which is islamacleod.com. And on that, I have events coming up in person in Somerset in England, I also have a retreat for Imbolc next February, which actually is very inspired by Bridget. So it's called The Return, and it's a rite of passage ceremony for women with a big fire ceremony, and we'll be weaving womb belts together. And come spring, I've got some online offerings, in fact, a 6-week online journey called Courting the Sacred, which I'm just streaming into and writing and planning at the moment. And also I'm active on Instagram. As you said, I share a lot of my images of tending the sacred. So you can find me there. It's Isla J. Macleod. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Isla. Sending love to each and every one of you, and just really honoring this beautiful space we've cultivated together today. And I encourage all of you to explore Isla's work and to keep exploring this topic of courting the sacred and pathways of belonging. So lots and lots of love to each and every one of you.